Welcome, everyone, to the English Bookcast.
Great to be here.
Today, we're doing a really deep dive into a pretty fascinating and controversial book, La antigüedad del hombre en el Plata by Florentino Ameghino.
That's right. It translates to the antiquity of man in the Plata, and it really digs into how long humans have been in the Plata River region down in Argentina.
Exactly. And before we jump in, we'd love it if you'd join the English Bookcast channel and maybe share our deep dives. It really helps us grow.
Definitely. Now, this whole question of human origins, how long people have been in certain places, it's always captivating, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And sometimes, well, pretty controversial too. Ameghino's work here tackles exactly that for the Plata region.
And it's worth remembering, he really faced some serious opposition back in his day for the claims he was making.
That's a key part of the story, so let's get into it. Ameghino kicks things off by looking at the Neolithic period in the Plata area.
The later Stone Age. He describes finding, the kinds of things you'd expect: stone tools, bits of pottery at the sites he explored.
Standard Neolithic evidence, then.
Pretty much, establishing that baseline. Then he goes further back into the Mesolithic period.
That transitional time between hunter-gatherers and early farming.
Right, and again, he documents artifacts from that era, things like weapons, different kinds of instruments, more pottery fragments. He's building a picture layer by layer, going back in time.
But he knew this wasn't going to be straightforward, right? He seemed very aware that digging into this topic would invite criticism.
Oh, absolutely. He explicitly mentions knowing he might be challenged on his authority, whether he was qualified to tackle such a big question.
He mentions specific opposition he'd already faced.
Yes, he talks about high and selfish representatives of science in the Plata, who had already opposed his earlier work using what he called ignoble weapons. Strong language.
Ignoble weapon sounds personal. What were they actually accusing him of? Especially regarding his big claim about humans being in the pampas during the entire Quaternary period.
Well, the Quaternary is what, the last 2.5 million years? That was a huge claim for the time.
Massive. So what names did they call him?
He says he was called an exploiter, even ignorant. Basically, they were attacking his credibility for daring to suggest humans had been in South America for such an incredibly long time.
But this wasn't just like an armchair theory for him, was it? He put in the field work.
Absolutely not. He makes a point of stressing his 10 years of continuous work studying what he calls the transport terrains, essentially the geological layers of the Plata Basin.
10 years on the ground, that's dedication.
It really is. And through that work, he built up these, as he puts it, interesantísimas colecciones, really interesting collections of fossils.
Discovering new species too, right?
Yeah, many species that were unknown before, significantly increasing the list of known quaternary animals just in the Buenos Aires region alone.
And alongside the animal fossils.
He was methodically exploring several prehistoric indigenous sites, stations, he calls them, and gathered thousands of artifacts. Stone tools, pottery, weapons, the actual physical evidence of human activity.
Okay, so he has the local evidence, the fossils, the artifacts. But then this story gets bigger, doesn't it? His work starts getting noticed internationally.
It does. This is a crucial point. He highlights that his collection of human artifacts from the Pampa was actually examined by some of the biggest names in European science at the time.
Like who?
Well, the list is pretty impressive. De Quatrefages, de Mortillet, Gervais, Cope, who was American, actually Carteloc, Villanova, Cappellini, Valdemar Schmidt, Heme, Ribeiro, Tobino. I mean, these were leading figures in prehistory and anthropology.
Top specialists. And what did they think? Did they buy his arguments about deep antiquity in the Plata?
According to Ameghino, yes. He states that they, without exception, approve the greater part of our demonstrations concerning the antiquity of man in the Plata.
Wow. Without exception. That's a strong endorsement, especially given the local resistance he mentioned.
A very strong endorsement. And it adds significant weight, especially coming after he himself had traveled to Europe.
Right, he went over there.
Yes, he visited major prehistoric collections and important sites in France, England, and Belgium. So he could compare his Argentinian findings directly with the European evidence firsthand.
That comparative perspective must have been invaluable for him.
Definitely. It allowed him to frame his arguments within the broader context of what was known about human prehistory globally at that point.
Despite this confidence, he also expresses a certain scientific humility, doesn't he? A willingness to be wrong.
He does. He mentions being guided by the words of a geologist, preparing himself for partial failure, and being ready to sacrifice his work if the facts demanded it later on. That shows a real commitment to truth over ego.
Which is what science should be about. and his plans were bigger than just the immediate Plata area.
Yes, he states his intention was to eventually extend his study to cover all the regions of the Plata Basin, a much larger undertaking.
And he was unusually open for the time, inviting critique.
Remarkably so. He openly invites observations, public or private, on his work to stimulate discussion and get closer to the truth. He acknowledged how tough it was, given how incomplete the fossil record always is.
He also directly confronts his critics again, doesn't he? Those he calls clinging to beliefs of other times.
He does. He really takes aim at those who resist innovation, who deny the right to even investigate human origins scientifically.
And he sees a parallel with earlier struggles in Europe.
Exactly. He compares the opposition he's facing to the resistance that the first proponents of quaternary human existence in Europe encountered. He sees it as the same kind of battle against entrenched thinking.
He even quotes someone, a Dr. Page.
Yes, quoting Dr. Page, talking about accusations made against modern science by people who are essentially ignorant of its basic principles and bound by non-scientific articles of faith. It really highlights the clash of worldviews.
Then he tackles the time question head-on, the idea that humanity is only, what, 6,000 years old?
His response there is incredibly emphatic. No, no. Milvice is no, no, no. 1,000 times no. He completely rejects that short timeline.
No ambiguity there.
None at all. He calls the arguments for it useless, sterile, vain. He was absolutely convinced of a much, much deeper human past.
And he believed that scientific progress would win out eventually.
Yes, he expresses this firm belief that humanity's understanding will keep advancing, despite the efforts of what he calls obscurantists trying to hold it back.
To support this idea of deep time, he brings up earlier European findings, right? Things that suggested humans might have been around even before the Quaternary.
Correct. He points to research at places like Somprest and Valdorno, where scientists had argued for human presence back in the Pliocene epoch.
Which is the period before the Ice Ages, before the Quaternary.
Exactly. And he also mentions the claim from 1872 by Amalias Deloy and others about potential human evidence worked flints from the Miocene period found at the Ney. That's going back even further.
So he's saying, look, the idea of deep human history isn't entirely new, even in Europe.
Precisely. He calls these memorable discoveries that should be remembered. He's positioning his own Argentinian findings as part of this ongoing scientific pushback against shorter timelines.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. Ameghino also touches upon how Europeans initially reacted to finding entire populations already living in the Americas. That must have been a shock to their worldview.
A huge shock. It posed a fundamental theological problem, didn't it? Given the dominant biblical narrative, the big question was, did these people descend from Adam? Were they part of that same human origin story?
A question with massive implications back then.
Absolutely. It challenged everything about the unity of humankind, creation narratives, the authority of Scripture, but of course the exploration went ahead, and Columbus found the Americas teeming with people.
Which then led to the next big question. Where did they come from?
Exactly. That became a central puzzle for theologians, philosophers, early scientists. You have these people, clearly different from Europeans in many ways, living across vast continents, completely unaware of the old world. How do you explain their origins?
And one of the more, let's say, creative explanations involved the old myth of Atlantis.
Right. Ameghino brings up Atlantis. The legends from ancient Egypt and Greek writers about a large continent out in the Atlantic, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that supposedly sank in a cataclysm.
And the theory was that people walked from Atlantis to America, a sort of land bridge.
That was one idea, that it served as a stepping stone or the original homeland from which people migrated to the Americas. But Ameghino applies some critical thinking here.
How so?
He points out that most proponents of the Atlantis theory place it sinking relatively recently, maybe only 3,000 years ago.
Which geologically is like yesterday.
Exactly. Ameghino argues that science, even in his time, showed that such a massive geological change, a whole continent disappearing, just couldn't happen that fast. If Atlantis existed and played a role, it had to be much, much further back in deep geological time.
Makes sense. He also mentions other ideas, like Phoenicians or Carthaginians reaching America.
Briefly, yes. That theory was often based on interpreting certain inscriptions found in the Americas as being similar to Phoenician or Carthaginian scripts. The idea being these ancient seafaring cultures could have made the voyage.
Lots of speculation trying to connect the old and new worlds.
It really shows the drive to find explanations, to link the unknown back to the known, even if the evidence was pretty thin sometimes.
Then there's the even stranger idea about pre-Columbian Christianity based on finding crosses.
Yeah, that's another one he touches on. Some people interpreted cross symbols found in the Americas as proof that Christian missionaries had somehow been there long before Columbus.
And attributing footprints in rocks to St. Thomas.
That was part of it, too. Ameghino mentions Father Lozano, who offered a counter-explanation for footprints. Maybe they were Phoenician travelers, who apparently had a custom of carving feet to mark a journey.
A slightly less miraculous explanation, at least.
A bit. But Ameghino then brings in the geological perspective, noting that geologists recognized such markings could form naturally on rocks over time, basically debunking the saintly footprint idea.
Right. Occam's razor, the simplest explanation, is often the best.
Pretty much. He also mentions Lozano seeing human footprints alongside animal prints in Paraguay, further suggesting natural origins.
Okay, so moving beyond myths and misinterpretations, Ameghino does explore actual possibilities of European contact before Columbus, right?
Yes, he definitely delves into this. He suggests that maybe some unknown earlier travelers from the Old World reached America, and perhaps accounts of their voyages, even garbled ones, influenced ancient maps.
Any specific examples he mentions?
He cites Columbus himself, finding wreckage of what seemed like a European ship in Guadeloupe. Also, Bartolomé de las Casas reporting that natives in Hispaniola told stories of white, bearded men arriving before Columbus.
Intriguing hints.
And Alonso de Ojeda apparently confirmed an English presence in Venezuela back in 1501, suggesting they'd been there earlier. Plus, of course, the much better documented Norse voyages.
The Vikings in North America.
Exactly. He mentions their voyages to Labrador around 1000 AD, and he even brings up Juan de Colno, a Pole working for the Danish, who supposedly reached Labrador even earlier, around 1476.
So the Columbus was first narrative gets complicated.
Very complicated. Ameghino also mentions the Zeno brothers' alleged voyages in the late 14th century and the known regular contact between Norse Greenland and Markland, a part of North America, by the Icelanders.
It sounds like the North Atlantic was potentially quite busy.
Potentially. He notes discoveries of lands west of Iceland back in 1288 and attempts to reach them. He even makes the remarkable point that these lands, like Vinland, were known enough in Europe that crusades were preached there, and the Pope authorized collecting tithes in Vinland in 1279.
Wow, papal authorization for tithes in North America in the 13th century.
It suggests a level of awareness and interaction that's often overlooked. He recounts details from the sagas about Norse settlement attempts, their encounters with the native Skraelings, even naming individuals who died there, like Thorbrand Snorre.
These feel less like myth and more like fragmented history.
They do. And he traces it back to Eric the Red settling Greenland in 986, and his son Leif Erikson exploring further west shortly after. He builds a strong case for a pre-Columbian European presence, at least in the north.
Does he explore possibilities from other parts of the Old World?
Yes, he briefly mentions the Welsh legend of Prince Maddox sailing to America in the 12th century, and maybe even earlier Irish voyages, though he acknowledges these are more tradition than hard history.
More speculative. What about from the East? Across the Pacific?
He brings up the theory of Chinese voyages, which some scholars supported. He notes their early knowledge of the compass and advanced map-making.
How might they have gotten there?
He mentions one specific argument, linking the distance. Chinese Buddhist pilgrims supposedly traveled 20,000 leagues with the length of the Kuroshio Current, that powerful Pacific current that flows towards California.
The idea being the current could carry vessels across.
Exactly. And he points out that there are documented cases in more recent history of Japanese fishing boats, junks, being swept by that same current and ending up on the coast of California. If it happened recently, it could have happened anciently.
Makes sense. He even mentions a Spanish ship getting carried by currents to Venezuela. The oceans can definitely move things around unexpectedly.
They certainly can. It opens the door to possibilities beyond deliberate, large-scale migrations.
So having explored all these potential contact scenarios, Ameghino shifts back to the Americas themselves, looking at the civilizations the Spanish actually found.
Right. He points to the advanced societies like the Inca in Peru. Their organization, their record-keeping with quipus, those knotted cords, their impressive farming, irrigation, roads, bridges.
Not exactly primitive societies.
Far from it. He talks about the Maya in Central America, with their cities, palaces, forts, schools, and importantly, evidence that what the Spanish saw was perhaps already a decline from an even earlier period of splendor.
A civilization with deep history already.
Yes. And the Aztecs in Mexico, he notes, seem to have built their empire on the foundations of an older, possibly more brilliant civilization that existed before them.
So the pattern he sees is one of depth. Civilizations built on top of earlier ones.
That's the key takeaway he emphasizes for the region from Mexico south to the Atacama. He sees layers of history, complex societies developing over long periods without clear signs that they were simply imported wholesale from the Old World.
And to counter the idea of a single origin, he points to the diversity within the Americas, both physically and linguistically.
Exactly. He lists examples of physical differences between various indigenous groups: hair texture, limb proportions, cheekbone prominence, eye shape, jaw structure, skin tones, even mentioning accounts of white Indians. It's not a uniform population.
Not one single race.
No. And linguistically, he makes the same point. The sheer number and variety of languages spoken across the Americas argue against them all, evolving from one single language brought over recently from the Old World.
He concedes there might be some minor similarities here and there.
He does, acknowledging what someone like Humboldt noted: occasional slave analogies, maybe an isolated tribe with language features echoing something from the Old World. But he sees these as exceptions, proving the rule of overall diversity.
What about shared technologies like the quipus or wampum?
He mentions the quipus in Peru and wampum belts in North America as record-keeping tools, and interestingly notes that similar knotted cord systems were used by ancient Chinese and Tibetans.
Suggesting contact or independent invention.
He doesn't definitively say, but it could be either. It shows similar needs leading to similar solutions. He does contrast these with the more developed writing system of the Mexicans, again highlighting internal American diversity.
He also revisits inscriptions, like that Guyton rock.
Yes, mentioning the Guyton rock and how interpretations ranged wildly: Atlanteans, Phoenicians, Siberians, Norse, or just a local Indian record. It shows how ambiguous such evidence can be.
And the Paraíba inscription in Brazil.
Also mentioned, with some believing it was Phoenician. He even refers back to his own 1880 work, where he argued that ancient South Americans did have writing systems, reinforcing his view of indigenous intellectual achievements.
Moving to archaeology, he describes dwelling sites.
Yes, things like natural caves or rock shelters that early people used, sometimes modifying them with stone walls. And he talks about the chulpas in the Titicaca region.
Those burial towers.
Exactly. He notes they range from simple stone piles to elaborate, well-built towers, suggesting development over time by the same culture.
And he compares them to European structures.
He notes the presence of circos de sol, sun circles, and other enclosures near the chulpas, drawing a parallel to megalithic sites in Europe, again hinting at either ancient connections or perhaps universal human tendencies in building monuments.
He uses Peruvian legends too, right, to suggest antiquity.
Briefly, yes. Mentioning tales of early dynasties, even giant invasions, not as literal history, but as reflecting a cultural memory of a very long past in the Andes.
And he sees this pattern elsewhere.
He says what's seen in Peru is repeated in places like Colombia. He also brings up the massive Teotihuacan pyramids near Mexico City, noting their ancient names and how they influenced later Aztec, building more evidence of deep roots.
And places like Palenque.
Ah, yes, the incredible ruins of Palenque in Central America, swallowed by the jungle. He describes the vastness, the architecture, like El Palacio, arguing that the sheer scale and decay implies a huge population and immense antiquity to reach that level of civilization.
Potentially older than recorded European history.
That's the implication. He's arguing for timelines that push American civilizations back into a past contemporary with, or maybe even predating, ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia.
He also mentions a specific find in North America: skeletons.
Yes, skeletons found in a mound in Florida, where the geological layers suggested an age potentially in the tens of thousands of years. Direct physical evidence challenging short chronologies.
And geologically, he argues that the Americas were experiencing similar things to Europe during the ice ages.
Right. While Europe had its diluvial terrains being deposited and megafauna roaming under glacial conditions, similar geological processes were happening in the Americas. The continents weren't on totally separate geological tracks.
Which leads to evidence of humans alongside those extinct megafauna in America.
Exactly. He recounts a discovery in the Mississippi Delta, a human bone found with extinct animal fossils. Lyell apparently tried to explain it away initially, but the association was there.
Others supported this association.
He cites Hammy, stating that humans living contemporaneously with extinct elephants, proboscideans, was well established in both Mexico, Anahuac, and the Rio Grande Valley.
And the California skull.
That's another key piece he mentions. A human skull found deep beneath layers of volcanic ash in California, suggesting an antiquity potentially even greater than the Mastodon and Mammoth era there, pushing the timeline back even further.
So based on all this, he challenges the whole idea that one continent must be older in terms of human population than the other.
Fundamentally, yes. He argues that without knowing what's on the submerged lands between continents, you can't determine absolute antiquity. There's no proven priority for Europe versus America.
Meaning migration could have gone in either direction or happened independently.
Precisely. There's no inherent scientific reason, he argues, to just assume America was populated solely by migrations from the Old World. Maybe people originated in the Americas, or maybe both continents were populated concurrently in deep time.
Even if large migrations weren't the whole story, he still wants to show that crossing oceans was possible, even before Columbus.
Yes, he uses examples like American Indians being taken to Europe against their will to show that the oceans weren't insurmountable barriers. He notes that even early monogenists, those who believed in a single human origin, emphasized ease of communication to support a recent populating of America. He flips it to say communication was possible much earlier, too.
He revisits the ancient myths here. Plato's Atlantis again.
Yes, and other ancient texts hinting at Phoenician voyages beyond Gibraltar, accidental landings on distant islands, Pliny talking about an island called Atlantis near the Atlas Mountains.
So these old stories might contain a kernel of truth about Western lands.
That's what he suggests. Even if you don't take Atlantis sinking in 24 hours literally, the persistence of traditions about large Atlantic lands, now gone, is something he finds significant.
But his main argument for ancient contact isn't myth, it's shared culture and artifacts, right?
Exactly. He proposes that if communication was more frequent way back when, you'd expect to see similarities. And he argues there are many striking analogies between the ancient civilized peoples of both hemispheres, more so, he claims, than between the peoples encountered at the time of conquest.
And he lists quite a few specific examples.
He does. Polished stone axes, civility pipes found in the Canaries, Egypt, Mexico, circular stone hammers in America resembling Etruscan ones, an American vase shaped like a human head analogous to Egyptian styles.
The colossal statues, too.
Yes, colossal heads and statues in Mexico, Central America, and Tiahuanaco in Bolivia, resembling Egyptian work. Hieroglyphic schist plaques from prehistoric Portugal, identical, he says, to ones in Patagonia. Carved ivory from the same ruins.
And the elephant depictions, those are particularly intriguing.
Very. The pipe carved like an elephant from a North American mound, and ancient Bolivian pottery painted with black elephants. Since elephants weren't native to the Americas then, that's hard to explain without some kind of connection or knowledge transfer.
Beyond artifacts, he mentions shared practices.
Yes, like cranial deformation reshaping skulls, which was common in parts of the Americas, and also practiced historically in Europe, like the deformation Toulousain in France.
And writing systems.
He notes the commonality of hieroglyphic writing among Egyptians, Etruscans, Iberians, the Guanches of the Canaries, and ancient civilized Americans, suggesting parallel developments or shared ancient roots.
He even brings in paleontology animal fossils to link the continents.
Right. He discusses tertiary period primate fossils found in both North and South America that actually resemble Old World species more than modern American monkeys, like Leopithecus and Protopithecus.
Suggesting ancient connections for animals, too.
Yes, a large monkey fossil found in the Pampean terrains of Buenos Aires comparable to modern apes. Plus, he notes Old World animals found in the Americas or vice versa, reindeer, beaver, musk ox found in European caves, and mammoths, Elephas primigenius and columbi, spreading across North and even into South America.
So shared fauna points to past connections.
It suggests that land connections, or closer proximity, must have existed in earlier geological times to allow these animals to spread between the continents.
Which leads him to talk about geology and actual land bridges.
Exactly. He argues the geology indicates large land masses have disappeared between the current coasts. He points to the relatively short distance between Greenland and Scotland, Norway, made even shorter by Iceland, the Faroes, Shetlands, suggesting a submerged North Atlantic bridge.
And in the Caribbean.
He mentions identical geological deposits and fossils of giant sloths, Megatheridae, on Cuba, Haiti, Puerto Rico, and the mainland, suggesting big rivers once flowed further out into a different Atlantic configuration.
And towards Africa.
He knows a submerged plateau extending from Brazil toward Africa, another hint of a possible past land connection.
So he's marshaling evidence from archaeology, anthropology, paleontology, and geology to build this picture of ancient connections.
It's a multi-pronged approach. And he contextualizes all this within the scientific revolution happening in his time.
Right. He acknowledges the huge impact of people like Lyell in geology and Darwin with evolution.
Yes, he mentions Darwin and transformism,
Hmm.
evolution, as a major shift based on accumulated evidence, comparing its acceptance to other established scientific ideas. He sees his own work, however challenging, as part of this broader scientific awakening.
So, how does he ultimately summarize his view on American origins?
He lays out several key points. First, American indigenous populations aren't one homogeneous race, but several distinct races mixed over time.
Okay.
Second, some groups do seem to represent races from the Old World, but the majority of the population is significantly different.
A mix, but predominantly distinct.
Third, the high level of civilization found by the Spanish, if it developed indigenously, absolutely requires a very, very remote antiquity for people in the Americas.
The complexity implies deep time.
Fourth, while there are many analogies between the Old and New Worlds, it's risky to just assume all American civilization came from the Old World.
Don't jump to conclusions about directionality.
Fifth, the sheer diversity of American races and languages strongly points towards an independent and very ancient origin within the Americas.
Diversity implies long, separate development.
Sixth, future research needs to seriously consider migrations going in all directions, not just one way, when studying ancient peoples.
A more complex model of movement.
Seventh, humans definitely lived in both the Old and New Worlds during geological time, not just recent history.
Deep time presence is key.
Eighth, ancient peoples of America, Europe, and Africa likely had more frequent contact in the distant past than in relatively modern times before Columbus.
More connections long ago.
And finally, ninth, communication back then was easier because of land bridges and islands that have since disappeared or changed. The geography was different.
Wow. That's a comprehensive and quite radical vision for his
It
time.
really is. A vision of deep, complex, interconnected human history spanning continents over vast geological timescales.
So, wrapping up our deep dive into Ameghino's La antigüedad del hombre en el Plata, his core message is really about that profound antiquity, isn't it? Humans in the Americas for potentially hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years.
Absolutely. And a complex origin story. Not just a simple migration narrative, but potentially independent development, plus ancient connections back and forth with the Old World, enabled by a different global geography in the distant past.
His work, even though controversial then and maybe some specifics were later refined, it was undeniably groundbreaking.
Oh, completely. He was passionately arguing for a deep, legitimate history for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, pushing back hard against the idea that their history only began recently or was solely derivative of the Old World. That was hugely important.
It really makes you think differently about the past. If these ancient connections were real, if the timeline is that deep, how does that change our understanding of human history as a whole, that interconnectedness across deep time?
That's the provocative thought, isn't it? It suggests a human story that's maybe far less linear, far more globally intertwined from much earlier periods than we often assume. It challenges us to imagine a past where continents we see as separate were once linked, allowing for exchanges we're only beginning to uncover. What stands out most to you from his arguments?
For me, it's that insistence on taking the American evidence, the geology, the fossils, the artifacts, the civilizations seriously on its own terms, and demanding it be integrated into the global story of human origins, not just treated as a footnote or a late arrival, that intellectual courage to challenge the status quo based on the evidence he had gathered.
Well said. A really crucial contribution to how we think about the peopling of the world.
It certainly gives us a lot to ponder. Thanks so much for exploring this with me today.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating piece of scientific history.
We really encourage our listeners to share your thoughts, do some more digging on Ameghino or early American archaeology. It's a deep well.
And we hope you'll join us again next time on the English Bookcast for another deep dive.
Yes. And please, if you enjoyed this, consider joining the English Bookcast channel and sharing this episode. It makes a huge difference. Until next time, keep reading, keep thinking,